This tutorial on the short answer question in APUSH. We're going to walk through the format of an SAQ, as I'm going to call it, because who's got time for short answer question? We'll talk about the design of them, how you respond to them, as well as how they're scored. So let's begin. So here is a typical short answer question that you might see on a test. There are other formats, and we'll get to those when the time comes. Note that it says briefly describe, briefly describe, briefly describe, and then it's got one way Native peoples adapted to their environment, one negative impact Europeans had, and one way natives adapted in response to interactions with Europeans. So there's kind of a standard language that you'll expect to see in many of these questions. Obviously, not all will be like this, but they're asking for very specific and direct responses. They're not asking for an essay. They're asking for you to straight up answer the question. Notice that the questions are kind of topically related. So it tends to be that a set of these questions roughly fit around the same time period or topic or idea. So it's not an essay. You're not being asked to write an essay question here, but a series of interrelated responses. Please note they are scored independently of each other. So what you answer in A has to be the answer for A. What you answer in B is going to be scored without considering what you wrote in A necessarily. So you can get the answer correct in A and miss it in B. It's important to note every answer needs to be a direct response to that particular question. Now, it sometimes happens with these that something you answer for A or B, you have to think of for C and either come up with something different or come up with a result or an effect of that answer you already described. So you might have to extend or consider your answer in light of response to an earlier question. That's not uncommon. And that just means you need to read all of these before you start. Don't start writing A until you've read B and C. It's a very important thing. Finally, it's really important to note that the grading of these is all or nothing. You either get the answer correct or you don't. There are no half credit, no partial points given for short answer questions. Either you're right or you're not. Here is a typical piece of lined paper that we would use for short answers if we were actually sitting in the classroom to do this. Note, you get this lined paper. I would give you this lined paper to use in class because I want you to practice just like we're going to have the real exam. Note that it's limited to that box labeled question 1. You can't write forever. You can't write until you've satisfied everything you know about the answer. It's called short answer for a reason. So you have to get to the point, and you have to get to the point quickly without wasting space. This format is also kind of mean for those of you who have big handwriting. So if you are one of those folks who writes really large, this is not in your favor. You're going to have to modify your handwriting a little bit. Or choose your words really carefully. It sometimes helps to visually split the page into 3 sections, just so you can make sure that you have saved enough space for each answer. I've seen people write way too much for A or B and then not really have enough room for C. And they only grade what's in the box. If you write outside of that box, it does not count. So just maybe draw yourself a line or a little tick mark to visually mark off the thirds on the page. It'll just help you make sure that you're staying, roughly within the space. Here's a scan of an answer from an actual AP exam that was done a few years ago. And you see the person has marked off each of their answers. So it's labeled A, B, C. And they've given a little bit of space in between. So they've roughly, split their page into thirds, roughly speaking, and provided a response to each of the questions. And they stayed inside the box. So what are the rules for all of this? Well, you get 40 minutes. It's about 13.3 minutes per question, or 4.4 minutes for each part. So 4.4 minutes for A, 4.4 minutes for B, 4.4 for C. That really pushes you to write a direct response in a short amount of time. They want to know if you really know the material and you're not just sort of like hemming and hawing and you can kind of get there slowly. You got to know it. If you don't know the answer right away, just skip it and come back to it. It does you no good to sit there and puzzle for minutes on end trying to figure out something and struggle when you could answer B or C if you knew those right away. So just tick mark off a third of your page and then come back later to that question. Maybe your brain will have thought, you'll caught up, and you'll go, oh gosh, I have an idea now. Maybe answering B or C will prompt you for better thinking for A. So there's no good in just like sitting there forever spinning your wheels. Skip and come back. It's better if you get credit for doing things right than for just trying to do everything and then mucking it up and getting it all wrong. Write neatly, because actual human beings have to read this, like me, and in a form that's not too large. We'll do our best as graders to try to figure out what you're trying to say, but I got to be able to make some sense of it. If I can't, there's no way I can score it. Make sure you read every part of the question, all parts of A, all parts of B, all parts of C before you start, because they might ask you to relate to each other. So you want to know what you're going to have to do. You want to know where you're going to be headed strategically. So don't just dive right in, read everything. Be specific as possible. The graders, the chief reader for APUSH has said time and again that you need to use specific vocabulary words. They want to know that you really understand U.S. history, that you're not just generally in the ballpark describing what's going on, that you really specifically know something about the American past. And explain your thinking. So just don't simply go, the answer is blah, 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 and then put a period on the end. You need to explain it, because explanation shows that you truly understand that material. So a good response is typically 80 to 100 words for the most part. One strategy that I've seen that people have used to force themselves to write a good answer is called ACE. ACE stands for Answer, Cite, Explain. It can be used in a lot of cases, I think even outside of the SAQ, to force yourself to remember to explain your thinking and to use specific vocabulary. The A stands for just a direct answer to the question. My answer to your question is bleh. That forces you to have a direct response, so the reader is aware that you know an answer. Cite is where you give some information or evidence that shows that you really understand the topic. This is a good place to use your vocabulary, the words that you are learning in class. So citing some information helps show to the reader that you truly understand. And then explain is probably the more difficult part for many of us. Sometimes we assume when we write that if I've given you the answer that I've explained it and that's enough. But you need to show how that evidence or the factual information supports your answer. So go to the extra step of actually explaining how what you're saying is supportive of your answer to the question. And sometimes explain seems a little bit redundant, like, why am I doing this? The answer is obvious. Well, it's not obvious. And the thing we have to remember is that we're writing for someone to judge our thinking, and their only window into our thinking, into what's going on up here, is what we tell them on paper. And they don't know you. They don't know you, the way you think. They don't know what you've been through in class. You've got to tell them what your thinking is. You've got to make that thinking visible on paper for them. So answer, cite, explain is a great strategy if you struggle with writing short answer questions. So let's try one together. So we're back to our briefly describe one way Native peoples adapted to their environment. Let's just do A. For A, answer, cite, explain, we need to come up with a way Native peoples adapted to their environment. So an adaptation. So my answer is Native peoples living along the eastern seaboard. I picked that one. That's the first one that came to mind. I could have picked the Pueblo people. I could have picked mound building peoples. There could be any number of groups, Plains Indians, any number of the folks that you've read about. But I picked the Native peoples on the eastern seaboard, and I could actually pick the western seaboard like Seattle and Oregon too. They developed diets and economies based on fishing. So if you live on a coast, it's very likely that you will use the coastal environment, fish, and products of the sea. You'll be much more comfortable with a water, based world. So there's my direct answer to that question. In cite, I'm going to use some specific vocabulary to show that I really know what those people are up to. So I know, for example, because we talked about this in class, Eastern Seaboard peoples used fish traps. The term for that is a weir, and I actually showed you a picture of a weir. We know they built dugout canoes, and I told you a story about some of these dugout canoes that I have seen. So they travel the waterways, they catch food, they're very comfortable on the water. Explain. So this might seem redundant, like I've just answered the question, why do I have to explain it? Well, I'm here taking this to the point of reinforcing that these people used what was in their environment and they created an adaptation to fit it. So eastern waterways provided an abundant source of food, so the peoples on those coasts adapted their technologies to take advantage of it. And then another idea popped in my head, and this is totally okay, because sometimes as you're thinking, more thinking happens. And I remembered that also some of those eastern coastal peoples made wampum, which is a set of ceremonial beads made from a shell that you can find on the coast up towards New York, Long Island Sound. And wampum could function as currency in early America. It functioned diplomatically, so it was a form of communication. It was valued and treasured. So living on the coast allowed those people to adapt to that and create a resource that they could use in their culture. So notice this looks long. It looks like it's way longer than it needs to be. This is actually about 88 words. So this really is within my recommendation of 80 to 100 words, even though it seems to be over-explained. There's nothing wrong with over-explaining. So we could do the same for B and C, and in fact, that's going to be something you're going to do. So I'm going to give you a practice question to work on. It's going to give you feedback and model answers. So try it out and see if something doesn't make sense to you. And if that happens, always reach out and ask. We can talk about it and figure out why your answer may or may not have worked. There are many possible answers for lots of these different questions. And you should know that the graders aren't looking for one right answer. Lots of different ways to get credit. So sometimes some of you with your really out of the box creative thinking brains go in places that I didn't expect. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I really like that. I really enjoy that. So give it a try and practice and let me know how it goes.